This is our Week 6 lecture for Anthropology 2351. The piece that we're looking at several, but the first piece that we're looking at this week is A Right to Health, Medicine, Marginality, and Healthcare Reform in Northeastern Brazil. This is by Jessica Scott Jerome. It was published in 2015, which makes it a very recent publication. Scott Jerome explains that the transformation of Brazil's healthcare system coincided with the country's emergence from 20 years of military dictatorship, and also a shift across Latin America and the world from the welfare state to privatized models of healthcare. I'm going to explain what these terms mean because they might not be as straightforward as one might expect. So the welfare state, what is that? Well, some of you may be familiar with what welfare is in the United States, right? It's kind of financial assistance that's offered to low-income families. This is not exactly what we're referring to when we talk about the welfare state. The welfare state is countries that are concerned with the well-being of their citizens and kind of make it their business to look after their health care, their education, etc., right? You can call it kind of, universal healthcare or a more socialized version of education, etc., etc. A more neoliberal approach, or this privatized model that it's referring to, is when individuals as consumers, not as citizens, as consumers, use their purchasing power to go into a marketplace to purchase the health insurance that they can afford, right? That's kind of more a United States model. We in the United States do not have health care guaranteed to us as a citizenship-based right. Not because you are a citizen can you just walk into any hospital and get the health care that you need. You need to have insurance, and that insurance is purchased as a private citizen in a marketplace, as a consumer good, right? And so your ability to purchase, it's entirely based on your purchasing power. It's not based on you being a citizen of the United States. That's the difference there. A welfare state kind of uses a more citizenship-based model, whereas these privatized models position individuals as consumers instead of citizens. So while others have analyzed Brazil's reforms, in order to assess and measure consequences, Scott Jerome is concerned with questions surrounding universal rights, social belonging, and citizenship. What universal rights do people have, right? I think if you look up the human rights, kind of the document that exists, Universal Human Rights, you will find a list, but as a kind of practical matter, how do those things manifest in people's lives? How do they access them, right? I just kind of talked about the difference between a citizenship-based model and a consumer model, right? If you look up human rights, well, all humans have the right to health and well-being, et cetera, et cetera. But it's very, very different if you live in a country that has a welfare state versus if you live in a country with a privatized model, right? So that kind of hints towards these ideas of social belonging and citizenship. Her work is essentially about the meanings and possibilities of new ideologies and practices of healthcare. For example, citizen participation in the formation of healthcare policy. This kind of speaks to the idea that often our policies are made by people who are quite out of touch with what the majority of the population is experiencing, right? Policymakers tend to have pretty good incomes. They tend to live pretty affluent lives, and they tend to not live the day-to-day experience of most middle-class and lower-class Americans, which kind of is a disadvantage because it means that just kind of by how the structure is, they're out of place with the needs of most people, right? Out of touch. And so what if citizens were to participate in the formation of policy, just average everyday citizens, contributing to healthcare policy? This is an idea that she throws out. On slide 3, she emphasizes how healthcare is a site in which social class, generational tension, aspiration, and citizenship are expressed and reproduced. So I'm going to unpack this for you as well. If we think about healthcare as a site in which social class is expressed and reproduced, well, there's a lot of things that people of a higher class can choose that people of a different class, lower class, can't choose, right? When I was doing research, I noticed that a lot of higher class women would schedule their cesarean section. They would schedule it for a Saturday at 1 p.m. because that was the most convenient time when all their family could be there, et cetera, right? Which, of course, is something that you can do if you are doing private healthcare and you're paying out of pocket. You can schedule it for whenever you want, right? But that's not kind of every woman experience. That's a class-based experience. Generational tension. There's things that one generation might think is perfectly fine, and there's things that a subsequent generation might think are not fine, right? Examples might include birth control, child spacing. I don't know, I can think of a number of topics. In my personal life, my husband and I are considering putting off having children. But what we might do to make that happen is to freeze embryos, because it's actually the age of the mother at the time the embryo was made that kind of is correlated to the likelihood that the embryo is going to be chromosomally normal, and not the age when the mother is impregnated. So if I was like 40, but I'm using an embryo from when I'm 30, then I'm going to have a pregnancy a lot like when I was 30. Uteruses don't change that much, but kind of the chromosomes and the genetics of your material changes a lot. And so this is, not the point. But the point is that I mentioned this to my mother-in-law, and she thinks that I want to put her grandbaby in the freezer for 7 or 8 years. How would you feel if someone put you in the freezer for 7 or 8 years, and you want to speak, and you want to talk, and you want to do things, but you can't because you're frozen? Well, okay, this might be a religious difference. It might be because she just really wants to be a grandma. It might also be a generational difference, right? Because these were not options that were available to her when she was in her reproductive life. And they are now available to us, and we're making choices that are just kind of outside of her realm of familiarity or imagination and just don't feel that comfortable, right? Aspiration. Well, I'm starting to do a lot of interviews here, and probably within the next month, I'll offer you guys an extra credit opportunity to do a focus group session with me, where we would talk about medical migration to Mexico, either to Matamoros or Reynosa or Progreso, to kind of get cheaper medical services and goods than would be available here on this side of the border. Why do people go? What are their motivations? How do they navigate danger and all these things, right? One of the things that I noticed the last time I did the focus group was that a lot of the reason why people go across the border has something to do with aspiration. And this is tied up also in aspirations for social class, right? An example is I know a woman who is a housekeeper, and she has 3 daughters, and they're university age or postgraduate age. And she works really hard and uses that money to put them in school and kind of hopefully give them a better life, right? She is only Spanish speaking. Her daughters are, some of them go here, and they're English speaking. But one of the things that she invests in for them not only is their education, but also for them to go to Reynosa to get braces, right? And you would kind of think like, well, what is underlying here? And this is not a criticism at all, but I think that maybe what might be underlying is an aspiration to give her daughters kind of pathways towards a middle-class life in the future. A middle-class life that she and her husband and her, parents never had. The whole reason why they immigrated to the United States was to kind of have a better life, right? This kind of American dream. And as we've seen when we talked last week about how working-class lads get working-class jobs, appearance kind of does matter, right? When you get to that job interview, if you get the job interview, if you have crooked teeth versus not crooked teeth, you look like a middle-class person or a lower-class person. These things do matter in a strange, disturbing, but truthful way, right? And so when she is investing in their education and she's investing in their braces, it's kind of a similar thing. It's not that she's investing in them looking better. She's investing in them having greater opportunities, right? So that has a lot to do with aspirations. You guys kind of see what I'm saying? All right. And then citizenship. Well, I kind of mentioned on the last slide how if people are to access services through Medicare or Medicaid, then they are accessing services as citizens, right? But if they're accessing services by going to Progreso, then they are accessing these services as consumers in a global market. And those are different things. So she tracks Brazil's amendment of healthcare into a right of citizenship rather than employment, and found that older Brazilians rarely sought healthcare on these terms, while younger, more affluent Brazilians rejected the notion of a collective good and sought the medical care of their choice under the rubric of consumption. So, there's this amendment of healthcare that now says that people have a right to healthcare through citizenship and not just through their employment in Brazil. Here, I access my healthcare through my employment, right? I get Blue Cross Blue Shield through UT, and that's the only option we have available to us, but it is what it is, right? It's pretty good insurance, but it's through employment. In Brazil, there's this shift towards citizenship. However, these younger, more affluent, I want to highlight more affluent, because probably if they were lower class, they wouldn't feel this way. They think, no, health shouldn't be a collective right. It's something that we should be able to make a choice about under the rubric of consumption. I should be able to buy whatever health care I want. But this is kind of a privilege of an upper class person to want to think that way, right? I remember when I was in Mexico, Seguro Popular, I may have mentioned to you before, is not universal health care, it's universal health insurance in Mexico, and it covers certain interventions, but not others, just like other insurance plans. But I heard this upper class woman complain that she really didn't like countries that had, I think she wasn't even complaining about Mexico, I'm pretty sure she was complaining about Sweden or another country that has like a universal healthcare system, because her husband is Swedish. And she was saying, no, I don't like that system at all. And I was saying, well, why? It has, really good outcomes compared to other countries around the world. And she said, well, because everybody gets the same. You go to the hospital, no matter who you are, you're going to get the same health care and the same treatment. I would rather go to a hospital and be able to get better treatment because I can pay for it. But that's kind of the privilege of an upper class person, right? And so she writes, we're going back to Scott Jerome, community residents confronted a healthcare system rooted in an ideology of individualized human rights layered on top of a social life deeply embedded in older systems of patronage and reciprocity, and a neoliberal economic context that celebrated market exchange and individuals' abilities to fulfill their own needs and interests. So there's kind of this historical change that in Brazil in the past, there was this system of patronage and reciprocity. In Mexico, it would be that, there's una hacienda con el patrón, right? And then under him, he has peones or trabajadores, and these people rely on him for their well-being, their income, right? It's a very kind of patriarchal system, and there's a lot of reciprocity, meaning yo hago para mi compadre y en otro momento mi compadre lo va a hacer para mí, right? Then there's this newer model that's neoliberal economic context, where it's really about individuals purchasing in a market to fulfill their own needs and interests. You're not relying on patron. You're not relying on tu compadre. You're relying on yourself to buy things, right? All right. Slide 4. Her ethnography delves into the complex relationship between a formal right to health and the ways this right is experienced by members of the community. Something that I've been touching on in every slide is that there's a big difference between formally having the right to something and that thing manifesting in your day-to-day life, right? When discussing health as a right, she is considering how rights are put into practice in people's everyday lives by organizing an individual's relationship to the collective. She is not considering the moral worth of abstract models. So, I may have mentioned before the difference between a normative argument and an analytical kind of argument. A normative argument is when you are making a judgment, a value-based judgment, and you're saying this is right or this is wrong or this should happen or this should not happen, right? She is not doing that. She is not talking about the moral worth of abstract models around health as a right. She is talking about kind of the real manifestation of individuals' relationship to the collective and analyzing that, right? How are these rights put into practice is what she's concerned with. Furthermore, she considers different positionalities, how physicians see themselves as attempting to provide preventative care, while patients endure long wait times to receive the tests and treatment they need for existing medical issues. Now, this is a criticism that you may hear about different countries that have universalized medicine. For example, I've heard it from Canadians who kind of have similar experiences in Canada, where they have, a universal health system. They can go to their government, clinic for care, but there's these long wait times, and that's very frustrating to patients, right? But physicians, they see themselves as doing their very best, given kind of the system. And I think that that is something that is true in many, many, many places, right? I once talked to someone who said something that really struck me. She said, I believe that there is the odd physician out there that maybe goes to medical school and residency and fellowship and internship and the whole shebang because they're greedy, because it's a well-paying profession, right? But this person opined to me, I believe that the vast majority of physicians do it because they want to help people. And I think that's probably true. Maybe I'm being optimistic, but I think that that's probably true. And so this frustration that's kind of bilateral on the part of doctors and of their patients, Scott Jerome is not trying to blame anybody or take sides or paint a black and white picture. She's just trying to explain the experience from the different positionalities of these different people and how they are experiencing the situation. On slide 5, referring to Pierre Bourdieu, she suggests that in order to fully realize healthcare reform, a shift in dosha, the experience by which the natural and social world appear as self-evident and goes without saying because it comes without saying, is required. So there are certain things that are reified in our lives. Reified means they just become so commonplace as to become a thing. They have like a thinginess. They're hegemonic. They're not questionable. We don't ever think to question them because it's like, well, that's just the way things are. They become so commonsensical to us. But that in order to realize healthcare reform, there needs to be a shift in that very kind of basic way that we think. We need to start asking, well, why? Not just, of course that's the way it is, right? Of course we buy health insurance in a marketplace. Of course you need to go purchase your health insurance. Okay, but why? Why is the health care system that way? Because surely there's other ways that you could have a healthcare system, right? All right, slide 6. This piece is called Blind Spot, How Neoliberalism Infiltrated Global Health. It is by Salman Khashoggi with a foreword by Paul Farmer, and it was published in 2014. Paul Farmer is a very famous medical anthropologist. I would say that as far as, quote, celebrity status goes within medical anthropology, he's probably the number one person. If you're not someone who's been exposed to medical anthropology, you're going to be like, who, right? But if you are a medical anthropologist, then you're going to think he's the coolest thing since sliced bread. So when I was 18 and I was studying at Brown, he came to the university and we had this lecture hall that was totally full and brimming, and people were waiting at the door trying to get in. It was the biggest lecture hall on the entire campus. And at the very end, I, like a groupie, asked to get a photo with him, and he said yes. And then this person, jumped behind me and photobombed my photo. So this is kind of how we feel about this person. Happened another time when I was at California, Berkeley, when I was a graduate student. He came to give a lecture there. And again, all the seats were filled. People were on the floor, people were on the aisleways, people were trying to come through the windows, and they closed the windows. So he's a very, very kind of exciting medical anthropologist for medical anthropologists. In the foreword, Paul Farmer points to how Keshav G served as a consultant for an NGO, caught up in the irresistible logic of neoliberalism, or that part of it that claimed all healthcare should be marketed and sold as a commodity like any other on the market. So, first he's signaling, Keshav G has a very particular positionality. And when we are reading texts, I've told you since the very first class that I don't want you to take that person's word for it, right? This goes back to our very first week when I had that PDF that was, getting the information yourself. Really question the experts. Put yourself in the position to be the one who decides what kind of is good information and what not. And so I'm not saying that this person has a good or bad perspective, but I'm saying this person has a very particular perspective as a consultant for an NGO. Consultants are paid fees. The fees are usually pretty high. Caught up in the irresistible logic of neoliberalism, or that part of it that claimed that all healthcare should be marketed and sold as a commodity like any other on the market. We can question that, right? Is healthcare like any other commodity in the market? Commodity is like a consumer item, right? Is it like anything else? I mean, handbags and shoes and men's watches and I don't know what else you would call commodities, cars, right? But is healthcare in the same bucket as that? Should it be? Is it necessarily, right? Because it says the part of it that claimed that all healthcare should be marketed and sold as a commodity like any other in the market. These NGOs imported a glossolalia that included words like privatization, user fees, efficiency, healthcare management, free trade, competition, cost recovery, community participation, and consumers. This vocabulary attempted to naturalize the so-called sustainable idea of selling medicines to starving people. Well, the point of this bullet is that all of these words are buzzwords that belong to a certain type of thinking, right? It's like one thought system, and all these words belong to it and are buzzwords to it and make sense within that particular thought process. But maybe if we stepped outside of that thought process, we would say, is it really natural, this idea that it's sustainable, within scare quotes, to sell medicines to starving people? This whole idea of, I want to be able to make choices and purchase my own health care in a privatized market. I've already pointed out that that's the luxury of an upper class person. But what about the lower class person who can't afford or can afford very, very limited types of health care in a privatized market because they're starving, right? What comes first if you are a person who has AIDS? Your food for this week or your medicines for this week, right? I mean, if you're put in that situation, it might be your foods for this week, not your medicines. But then the issue becomes that you get sicker, and also you could potentially be contagious to other people, and the epidemic grows, right? All right, slide 7. The shift to private payers, poor patients and their families, would decrease public expenditures, quote, decentralize healthcare, and reduce frivolous spending. Now, this is the argument from the side of someone who is arguing for further privatization, right? They're saying, let's decentralize healthcare. Let's decrease public expenditures. Let's reduce frivolous spending. This is kind of, in the United States, it would be a present-day Republican trickle-down sort of argument, right? Like, of course you all want less taxes and you want more money in your paycheck, but the flip side of that is for people who are at the lower end of the socioeconomic totem pole, you're left as a consumer to purchase your health care, which you may not afford, right? And healthcare is not a citizenship-based right. It's something that you buy as a consumer if you are able, if you have the purchasing power. There's this argument that when people have access to healthcare, they would just spend frivolously, whereas if they had to buy it, they would be more responsible and maybe consider a bit more before they actually purchase the healthcare. So this is the two sides of this argument. Farmer argues that NGOs are key players in transforming patients into consumers and non-consumers. NGOs are non-government organizations. It's an acronym. And he's saying that not only is it, government organizations that play a role in shaping the way that patients engage with healthcare, but these NGOs are also key players. On slide 8, however, according to Jim Yong Kim, the 12th president of the World Bank, privatization policies are not ultimately beneficial to the health of the poor. Jim Yong Kim is a very, very good friend of Paul Farmer. They went to Harvard together, where they studied medical anthropology. Paul Farmer has an MD, but he also has a PhD in medical anthropology, and Jim Yong Kim also has a PhD in medical anthropology. And Jim Yong Kim went to Brown, so I'm kind of, alumni fever over there. But he has this perspective where he says that these privatization policies are not ultimately beneficial to the health of the poor, which I think is kind of clear, as the lecture has unfolded. Furthermore, Kim argues that health outcomes are often incidental to the design and financing of health systems. When we are planning a health system, what comes first? It's kind of a chicken or egg argument, right? Is it that we are going to think, what type of health system would result in the best health outcomes for this population? All right, now that we figure that out, how are we going to finance it? Or is it, well, what can we afford? What's the best economic scheme? And then the health outcomes are what they are, right? And he is saying that given the present situation of privatization, it's really the latter. That there's this entire kind of health economic scheme that is in place, and then the health outcomes are entirely secondary, right? All right. Farmer argues that it is nearly impossible to achieve equity and access to health care when neoliberal paradigms underpin health care delivery. Now, we've talked about equity before, right? The difference between equity and equality, where equality is giving everybody the same treatment, and equity is giving everybody the resources that they would need so that they have equal opportunities. The resources that you invest in them may be different based upon the person so that the opportunities that they have are equal, right? And so equity would argue that sometimes what is, quote, fair is not really fair. We've talked about this before, correct? Okay. So here they're saying that if the paradigm that we're using is neoliberalism, which is to each his own, as a consumer, in the private market, purchase whatever you're able, that disables the entire idea of equity, right? Nobody is being given, the little kid is not being given a bigger box so he can see over the fence to see the baseball game, right? Everyone is just left to their own resources, and the shortest child has no way to see over the fence. All right. While he doesn't see the end of neoliberalism in sight, he argues that there is ample room for resistance to the crass commodification of health. Ending neoliberalism would be overturning an entire economic system. This is something that was mentioned to us in our last class. Is this possible? How do we change an entire economic system? And he says that the end is probably not in sight. However, we can resist what he calls the crass commodification of healthcare. That is just kind of grossly going to the extreme of considering healthcare something to be purchased instead of something that people have rights to. Essentially, he is hopeful about change and wonders how to universally provide healthcare to all citizens. We are now on slide 9. Keshavji points to the role NGOs played in transforming healthcare in Badakhshan from a universal socialized cradle-to-grave system to a privatized apparatus, shaped by the interest of foreign donors, including the idea that, quote, the market is most efficient in distributing limited health resources and that cost-sharing would bridge the gap between humanitarian assistance and long-term development. Okay. Universal means everybody, right? All citizens of that country. Socialized, very similar concept. Cradle-to-grave system means that the government is responsible for your health and well-being from the moment that you are born until the moment that you die. To a privatized apparatus shaped by the interests of foreign donors. So much of what happens in the third world is determined by the donations from the first world, right? Including the idea that the market is the most efficient in distributing limited health resources. This kind of goes to, you may have heard before in, for example, election debates, that the trickle-down system is the best, right? If we really let the market do what it does and we try to bolster the market and make it very strong, then that's good for everyone. Because if corporations and companies are strong and they're making a lot of money, that produces more jobs, and then the, quote, little guys will have, work and they'll have steady employment, etc. This is the argument of a kind of a trickle-down argument, right? So that's the idea that the market is most efficient in distributing limited resources. And, of course, this piece is challenging that and really questioning it. And that cost sharing, that means that perhaps the insurance or the government is partially responsible, but that poor and starving person also should share in the cost, bridges the gap between humanitarian assistance and development. Humanitarian assistance meaning kind of, handouts from altruistic people through the trope of humanitarianism, and true development where a country becomes stronger and more developed. And so there is a criticism happening here. There's a questioning. Keshavji recognizes that NGOs are not accountable to communities in their home country of the areas where they work. Rather, they receive grants that are structured to serve the donor's aims. I've shared this example in my other class. I'm not sure if I've shared it here. But I was once on the board of an NGO in Michoacan, and they were serving Perepechan women. And these women have a history of being of forced sterilization. And so they have been kind of facing what they consider to be genocide, right? Kind of decades where local clinics would place IUDs without their consent or their knowledge. And then 10 years later, they would wonder why they hadn't had any children. And, they would go and find out that they, the entire time, had an IUD that they didn't know about, right? And so then the Kellogg Foundation comes along, this is about 2016, and wants to offer educational workshops to the women, and offers a grant to whatever non-governmental organization, civil association, is going to put these workshops in place. And the workshops would teach the local women about birth spacing, how to use birth control so they can have fewer children, with the idea that they're going to be empowered and have more freedom in their life to move towards gender equity and more education for women, right? Well, this idea sounds very good from a middle-class U.S. perspective, but from the perspective of that community, it sounds like more of the same. More of kind of, first world or colonizing outsiders trying to control and reduce their reproduction to continue to, feed into genocide and having fewer of their people on the planet, right? So of course, this is not. It's an ill-fit kind of plan for that particular location. But the NGO is not accountable to the women. The NGO is trying to get a grant that's structured by the Kellogg Foundation and the Kellogg Foundation's interest from wherever the headquarters of the Kellogg Foundation is, which is definitely not in Michoacan. Also, the interests are definitely not authored by Purépechan women, right? So that's what this point speaks to. Slide 10. He documents the social upheaval that resulted from abrupt, unbuffered submersion into radical neoliberal privatization and essentially a renegotiation of the relationship between citizens and the state. By now, I think you've understood kind of what neoliberal privatization is, that it's really this shift away from government responsibility towards this global marketplace where consumers are responsible for their own well-being based upon their purchasing power. And that has changed the relationship between citizens and state. While critiquing the commodification of healthcare delivery, he points to neoliberal programmatic blindness leading to the original aims of projects getting lost or ignored. So in the last example that I offered you about the Purépechan women, offering these workshops, it has a kind of programmatic blindness, right? Meaning that the real aim of the project is to empower women, right? But that aim kind of gets lost or ignored in the process of carrying it out because the form is ill-matched to the realities of those people. And the actual workers or staff people who are carrying out these workshops have a sort of, blindness to what's happening. Like Scott Jerome, he is concerned with, quote, discursivity in culture, how a specific set of ideas can define the construction of institutions, programs, and practice. This is from page 12. So a little bit ago in this lecture, I was referring to kind of how there's a certain thought process, right? And there's all these buzzwords that make sense from within that thought process as its own kind of coherent system. But if you stepped outside of that thought process, they might not make sense anymore as concepts, right? And this is what he's saying, that there's this discursivity in culture, and a specific set of ideas define the construction of institutions, programs, and practice. If we stepped away from those ideas, the results would be entirely different. All right, on slide 11, I'm going to show you guys some clips so that you have some familiarity with Paul Farmer and also with Jim Young Kim, and you know who these actors are. So you can become familiar with them. Okay,